On February 10th, investigators released the image the public had been waiting for. A masked man stood on Nancy Guthrie's porch, armed, covered, and moving with intent. And within hours, the case stopped being a disappearance in the public mind and became a loop. People replayed the same frame again and again: the mask, the backpack, the holster, the posture. The internet did what it always does. It grabbed the most visible piece of the story and treated it like the whole thing. Everyone started asking the same question, like, who is that man? But that is not the only question that matters here. In fact, it may not even be the biggest one. Because the Nancy Guthrie case was never just about the man on the porch. It was about the sequence around him, a sequence so tight, so strange, and so specific that it reads less like chaos and more like a controlled collapse of ordinary signals. I am not here to turn one surveillance image into a cheap answer. I am here to tell you why this case gets darker the moment you stop watching the suspect and start reading the timeline. Because the image explains presence. That is all. It does not explain access. It does not explain control. It does not explain movement. It does not explain what happened inside the house, what happened after the camera went dark, or what happened between the first digital fracture and the moment Nancy Guthrie vanished. That is where this case stops looking like a simple intrusion and starts looking like a structure, a system, a chain. And chains matter because chains are harder to dismiss than speculation. Start with the clock. Nancy Guthrie was last seen on the evening of January 31st after being dropped off at her home in the Catalina foothills near Tucson. Public timelines say she returned home at around 9:48 p.m. The garage door opened. 2 minutes later, it closed. That was the last publicly reported moment in this story that still looked normal. Then normality broke apart. At 1:47 a.m., her doorbell camera disconnected. At 2:12 a.m., software detected a person. At 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker app disconnected from her phone. That is a 41-minute window. 41 minutes between the first digital break and the last technological signal tied to Nancy Guthrie's body. That is not a vague blur. That is not background noise. That is a sequence investigators can build around. And once you understand that, the case changes shape immediately. Because 41 minutes is not just time. It is operational space. If the camera disconnect at 1:47 marks the beginning of the event, then something at the house changed before Nancy Guthrie was fully off the grid. If the pacemaker app disconnect at 2:28 marks the point where her phone was no longer connected in the ordinary way to the device tied to her body, then by that point the disruption was no longer just outside the home. It had already become personal, physical, immediate. That does not tell us exactly what happened in those minutes, but it tells us something crucial. This was not one random image floating in isolation. It was one visible moment inside a much more disturbing progression. Then came the footage. Authorities released images and video showing a masked person outside Nancy Guthrie's front door in the early hours of February 1st. Reuters reported that the person appeared armed, wearing a ski mask, gloves, a backpack, and a holstered gun, and was seen tampering with the doorbell camera. Reuters also cited a law enforcement source saying the individual's head was down as he approached, suggesting awareness of the camera's location. That single detail matters more than people realize. Awareness changes the case. A person who walks toward a camera and interferes with it is not wandering blindly through a scene. He is responding to surveillance as an obstacle. He is treating the home's visibility like something to manage. That is not accidental behavior. That is purposeful behavior. Reuters, but here is the trap. The more replayable the footage becomes, the easier it is to mistake it for completeness. It is not complete. It gives the public a suspect-shaped object to obsess over, but it does not answer the most dangerous questions. It does not tell us how entry was gained. It does not tell us whether Nancy Guthrie knew the person. It does not tell us whether the suspect was alone. It does not tell us what happened after the camera was tampered with. And that is why The public version of this case and the investigative version may be two very different things. The public sees a man. Investigators see a progression. The public sees a mask. Investigators see timing. The public sees a frame. Investigators may be looking at everything outside it. Then you add the physical evidence and the timeline gets heavier. Authorities said blood found on the porch outside Nancy Guthrie's home was confirmed to be hers. Law enforcement has described the case as an abduction or kidnapping investigation, and officials publicly warned that she may be in danger without necessary medication. Reuters reported that family members and investigators described her as frail, of limited mobility, and in need of daily medication to survive. That matters because blood changes the temperature of the case instantly. Once blood is confirmed at the point of disappearance, the story is no longer just about a missing person and a suspicious image. It becomes a case in which biological evidence, interrupted surveillance, a detected person, a disconnected pacemaker app, and a missing elderly woman all sit inside the same narrow timeline. Those details do not solve the case, but they do destroy any comforting illusion that this is simple ambiguity. Now look at the suspect description, because this is where the public gets pulled into the most frustrating part of the case. According to the FBI, the suspect was described as a male of average build, approximately 5'9" to 5'10", wearing a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack. NBC reported that the FBI later released those details, while BBC reported that investigators believe the clothing may have been purchased at Walmart and had been reviewing surveillance from nearby stores. That sounds specific until you realize how generic it also is. Average height, average build, dark clothing, common backpack, useful enough to circulate, common enough to be maddening. It gives people something to compare, but not enough to end the guessing. And that is where cases like this become unstable online. People start treating description like resolution. It isn't. A suspect profile can sharpen attention without identifying anyone at all. Then the case gets louder, and louder does not mean clearer. Ransom communications entered the story. NBC reported that at least 3 news outlets received a note tied to the case, while law enforcement had not substantiated it. BBC reported that multiple apparent ransom notes were under review and that at least one was determined by the FBI to be fake, leading to the arrest of a man in California. That detail is huge because once one note is proven false, every communication around the case becomes harder to trust. And yet the word ransom changes how the public reads everything. People hear it and immediately think motive, money, direction, script. But the official posture remained cautious. The family publicly asked for proof of life. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings made emotional pleas, said they were willing to communicate, said they were willing to pay, and later offered a $1 million reward. The FBI and Tucson Crime Stoppers added more reward money. That combination, family urgency, public visibility, uncertain communications, official caution, does not create clarity. It creates noise. And noise is dangerous because it redirects attention. It amplifies the wrong things. It plants theories before evidence is ready to support them. This is why the Nancy Guthrie case has to be read through layers. The first layer is the visible layer, the masked man, the porch, the footage, the backpack, the blood. That is the layer the public can replay. The second layer is the timeline layer. 9:48 p.m. drop off, 1:47 a.m. camera disconnect, 2:12 a.m. person detected, 2:28 a.m. pacemaker app disconnect missing by midday. That is the layer investigators can map. The third layer is the uncertainty layer. Ransom messages of unclear legitimacy, DNA that may or may not resolve the case, questions about entry, movement, and what happened after the visible evidence ends. That is the layer where this case remains alive. And that is exactly why. The biggest public mistake is assuming the footage is the story. It isn't. It is one section of the story, the section law enforcement was willing to release. And what investigators release is not the same as everything they know. Now look at the DNA narrative, because this is where public expectation and real investigation split apart. At one stage, A glove found roughly 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home became a major focus, but later reporting from BBC and ABC said that glove was ultimately traced to a local restaurant worker unrelated to the case. At the same time, NBC reported that investigators were still examining other DNA found at Nancy Guthrie's property and were considering genetic genealogy as a possible avenue for analysis. That matters because it shows how real cases actually move. The public wants one perfect clue, one break, one dramatic reveal. Real investigations do not usually work like that. One lead collapses. Another becomes more important. One clue gets headlines. Another does the real work quietly. The glove may have died as a lead, but that does not mean the forensic core of the case died with it. In fact, once noisy evidence falls away, what remains can become even more valuable. And this is where the case gets even more frustrating for people watching from the outside, because the public wants simplicity and the official language keeps resisting it. Some people want this to be a clean narrative. Masked intruder appears, elderly woman disappears, ransom angle emerges, story explained. But the public facts do not behave like a clean story. They behave like an incomplete one. If the footage answered the case, the biggest questions would already be gone. If the ransom angle answered the case, investigators would not be so careful. If the glove answered the case, it would not have fallen apart. And if the visible evidence told the whole truth, the invisible parts would not still dominate the investigation. But they do. They dominate it completely. That is why this case does not feel solved, and it does not feel cold. It feels pressurized, one layer away from breaking. There is another reason this case keeps pulling people back in: the gap between public speculation and official wording. BBC reported that Sheriff Chris Nanos said all siblings and spouses in the Guthrie family had been cleared as possible suspects, while also not ruling out the possibility of an accomplice. That is important because it shows investigators doing what the internet hates most: closing one category while refusing to simplify the rest. Online, people want instant certainty. Investigators do not work that way. They clear one lane. They keep another open. They narrow some theories. They preserve other possibilities. That may feel unsatisfying from the outside, but it also tells you something crucial. Law enforcement is still treating this as a living investigation, not a finished narrative. And then we get to the one detail that may sit at the center of everything: the digital silence. Because this case may ultimately not be about a single image at all. It may be about a timed collapse of normal signals. A camera disconnects. A person is detected. A pacemaker app disconnects. A woman is gone. That is not random. That is progression. That is why the case feels so dark. Not because the public knows too little, but because the structure of what little the public does know is so unnerving. Once you read the case that way, the masked man becomes the edge of the event, not the center of it. The public is staring at the edge. Investigators are likely trying to rebuild the center. So here are the questions that still matter. How was access gained to the house? What happened to the removed camera? Was the suspect alone? Were the ransom communications genuine, fake, mixed, or opportunistically layered onto the case by outsiders? What additional footage or data have investigators seen that the public has not? And most importantly, what happened between the first digital disruption and the moment Nancy Guthrie disappeared from the systems that should have helped locate her? Those are not side questions. Those are the case. They are the reason this story refuses to settle into something simple. That is why this case remains so haunting. The public sees the porch, but the porch is not the whole house. The public sees the suspect, but the suspect is not the whole event. The public sees the frame, but investigators are still trying to understand everything outside it. And in a case like this, that difference is everything. The case may look stalled from the outside. That does not mean it is standing still. Evidence can be processing even when the public hears nothing. A timeline can be tightening even when no arrest is made. A case can be moving in silence. And whoever thought this investigation would remain trapped inside one image may have badly misread how real cases work. Because images drive attention, timelines drive cases, and if you want my view, The Nancy Guthrie case was never just about the masked man. It was about the 41-minute window, the blood on the porch, the digital silence, the unstable ransom narrative, and the widening gap between public obsession and investigative reality. That is what makes this case so dark. And that is what keeps it alive.